We are delighted to have joining with us tonight two very inimitable people, two experts on Israel and international law and human rights. We have Natasha Hausdorff, who is the legal director of UK Lawyers for Israel Charitable Trust. And we also have with us Arsen Ostrovsky, who has come all the way from Israel. I'd like to say he's come all the way from Israel, especially for us, but that would be exaggerating slightly. But we're delighted to have him here in England with us. He is the CEO and chair of the International Legal Forum, which does a lot of work here in the UK. So for those of you who are here with us, there's others joining as I speak. You probably are aware that this morning the news broke that the Foreign Office, the Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office, has confirmed that the UK will not be attending the Durban IV commemorative conference, and for good reason. The track record of the Durban Conference is from the very first one in 2001, which was a UN conference against racism, very quickly descended into the antithesis of that, with a very hideous, I can't even say an undertone, a very hideous tone of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, and in fact, very anti-Jewish activity. The original conference consisted of an NGO forum and a government conference, and unfortunately both descended into anti-Semitic platforms. In 2011, the then British Prime Minister David Cameron withdrew the UK from what was Durban IV. That was the 10-year anniversary conference. And now we're in 2021. And, as I've said, and as you all know, thankfully, the UK government under the leadership of Boris Johnson has shown that it's going to remain on the right side of history by withdrawing its attendance. Nobody has come here to listen to me this evening, so I shall very quickly hand over now to Arsen Ostrovsky, who, as I said, is the CEO and chair of the International Legal Forum. And Arsen will give some background and some analysis regarding Durban. So thank you very much, everyone. If you can just all keep your microphones on mute, and if you can share any questions that you might have in the chat facility, I'll message in there in a moment, inviting everyone to ask questions. Thank you very much. Over to you, Arsen.
All right, cheers. Thank you for that, Steve. I have to say, I came all this way and I was so excited about speaking here before you guys, which I still am. And then Her Majesty's government decided to announce this morning that they're pulling out of the Durban Conference, which I think they must be applauded for. But I think also, as we spoke about before, even though this was an important victory, the battle still continues. Before I do sort of say a few more words, I did want to just especially acknowledge the incredible work that you guys do at the Zionist Federation. It's as someone who's coming from Israel, I can certainly say it's deeply and sincerely appreciated. I know we have just in the last weeks have come out of a very devastating and difficult period with, as you of course know, with the war with Hamas in Gaza. And even though we have a ceasefire that is beginning to hold, we are certainly in Israel also cognizant of also what is happening in Europe, and there's some of the very the jarring scenes we saw out of London, we're still seeing today. And so just in as much as the Zionist Federation led the effort and solidarity standing with Israel during our times of need, just wanted to also reassure your community that we likewise stand with British Jews, as you too are facing difficult circumstances at the moment. So with that said, look, I think it is important to underscore with respect to Durban that even though this particular battle or this particular victory is important, it's the war of narratives, I think, that really continues. For those that sort of perhaps are not aware, to put this in a little bit of context, this Durban Conference, which was originally held in 2001 in South Africa, in Durban, South Africa, it was held under the auspices of the United Nations. I think that's important to also to underscore here, that this is not one or two countries coming together. This is the United Nations coming together. The world's foremost multinational, multilateral body that's in charge with not only promoting peace, but also fighting racism and discrimination. And this particular conference in 2001, it was really the international community coming together under the umbrella of fighting racism, discrimination, and xenophobia. But what it became was actually a conference promoting racism, discrimination, and xenophobia. But in particular, it became this visceral hotbed of, there's no other way to put it, but just unbridled Jew hatred in the worst, most obscene kind you can imagine, from vilification of Israel to references to Hitler, to Holocaust denial, to slurs about Israel being an apartheid state. The whole Zionism is racism mantra, the resolution of the United Nations, which was which we saw in 1975, but then ultimately reversed, was really reborn in so many ways. We saw distortions of the Holocaust. We saw Israel being accused of war crimes, crimes against humanity. No other country was singled out in such a way as Israel was. But I think perhaps most importantly, what we saw is also that Durban acted as a catalyst of the modern BDS, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. It crystallized in Durban in 2001 and developed into something that we're seeing today in the UK, in Europe, in North America, and around the world. It really formed the intellectual foundation behind it. It formed the civil society background to it, and it really was really the catalyst for the whole movement, the process of singling out Israel for opprobrium, for delegitimization, and for demonization, which, by the way, is the very essence of Natasha Sharansky's test of anti-Semitism, if you know the 3Ds, delegitimization, demonization, and double standards. So this, I think, fits that criteria very, very clearly. This was something that happened 20 years ago. This coming September, the United Nations will be marking 20 years. It'll be a celebratory event. It'll be a celebration of Durban and the declaration that was developed in Durban, subsequently reaffirmed in countless number of conferences, resolutions, and events at the United Nations. The same declaration that singled out Israel for opprobrium, that attacked and vilified the Jewish state. That is something that will be at the top of the agenda again when it comes to September. What will be happening, I should say, is in the General Assembly at the United Nations in New York, there will be a number of events centered around this. And interesting to note, the main event that will be also attended by heads of state, by world leaders, presidents, prime ministers, will be on September 22nd. And September 22nd, just so everyone knows, is also the second day of Sukkot. Sukkot is one of the major Jewish holidays. So as the UN does, yet again, they are holding such a prominent event to single out and attack the Jewish state on one of the most holy Jewish holidays on the calendar, when they also know that so many Jews around the world, especially outside of Israel, who mark the second day as a holiday, will be away from their computers and smartphones. But such as the United Nations, we've seen the UK withdraw from the conference today, citing concerns of anti-Semitism. We've already seen the United States withdraw several weeks ago, followed by Australia and also Canada. So there's been 4 countries already that have withdrawn from this conference, each one of them alluding to concerns regarding its anti-Semitic nature in terms of the singling out of Israel. I'm hopeful, and I would expect that other friendly nations will follow in Europe, such as perhaps Hungary, Austria, Czech Republic, some of the countries in Central Eastern Europe, and of course some of their friends in Latin and South America. Ultimately, this conference was created in sin, and it deserves to be in the dustbin of history. Any country that truly cares about fighting racism, about fighting xenophobia, intolerance, discrimination, will not give any kind and should not give any kind of credence to this, what is essentially a hate fest. It is a hate fest against Jews and against the sole Jewish state, Israel. The last point I would make, perhaps, because I really much rather have a conversation, and I know there's a lot of questions in terms of how we move forward, and I know Natasha, who's doing incredible work also with the UK LFI, has a lot of important things to say. But I'll just sort of conclude with this. What we are seeing today on the streets of Europe, including in the UK, including the scenes we saw in the convoy of cars, driving through London, chanting those horrific things, including elsewhere in London when we saw people chanting, we want Zionists, we want their blood. The most jarring, horrific things we've seen, including violence and assaults and Jews being beaten up across Europe and across North America. This does not happen in a vacuum. This does not happen in a vacuum. It is the direct result of this pervasive discourse vilifying the state of Israel, demonizing the Jewish state, that really was manifested in Durban in 2001. Durban gave it the foundation and mainstreamed this hate. What we're seeing today is a direct result of what we saw, what was created in 2001. Words have actions, words have consequences and ramifications. And when vilification of Israel persists and is only intensified in the last month, as we saw, when anti-Semitic tropes are thrown around so casually, and when good people in good countries that truly do care about fighting anti-Semitism and racism and promoting tolerance and peace, when they fail to speak out, when they fail to withdraw from conferences such as these, violence occurs, Jews get beaten up. That is a direct correlation of the kind of vitriol and hate that we're seeing, that was created and established through the Durban 2001 conference, and which is why it's all the more important that those that do truly care about peace and standing up to racism speak out against this conference in 2021 that we'll be seeing at the United Nations in September. With that, Stephen, I think I might leave it for now, unless there's any specific questions, and otherwise more than happy to take further questions later.
Okay, Arsen, thanks. So we've got a couple of questions. Firstly, someone is asking, where can they find the proposed agenda and structure of what is planned? Where can they find it online? I'm assuming it perhaps is too soon for that information. I don't know. Are you able to?
It is available to some extent. I mean, there are still certain aspects that are being worked out. The preparatory meetings have started out a long time ago, but the agenda is more or less known in advance. And what we do know, and what is for certain, is that this conference coming up in September will endorse fully the original declaration that was adopted in Durban in 2001. And that is what is a primary concern here, notwithstanding whatever other items that might be on the agenda. And there will be other items on the agenda, including with respect to Africa and elsewhere. But we know that the original Durban Declaration will be adopted, and this is this very same declaration that singled out Israel, that vilified Israel, and that really tried to strip Israel of its very rights. We also know that given a lot of the circumstances that and political climate that we're seeing today, including a rising out of Gaza, including, as we've seen with the Human Rights Watch report, they try to slur Israel and portray it as engaging in apartheid practices. Apartheid is one of the most, horrific crimes one can be charged with, and connecting that to South Africa, to Durban, and then applying it to Israel, I think is something that's even more malicious and vicious. We know the BDS movement will use it as a catalyst. So it doesn't take too much effort to connect the dots here, but there is an agenda available, and I'd be happy to send it to you after, and you can also circulate it to the community.
Fantastic, which I will do in the follow-up email to this tomorrow. So another question: who is? We know that you've mentioned that the 2001, the original Durban I conference was the UN conference against racism. Who is organising Durban IV? Durban IV is commemorating and reaffirming the previous Durban conferences and reaffirming the declaration. Who is behind the organisation of this one?
In a short answer, it's the United Nations. As the original conference was held under the auspices of the United Nations, so were the previous conferences, the follow-up conferences in 2009 and 2011. I was actually present at the one in 2011. I was in New York at the time, and one of the reasons the 2011 one, which was the 10-year anniversary, really tapered away was because the 16, I think it was about 16 countries or so, had pulled out of the conference, including many countries from Europe, in addition to the United States, Canada, and Australia. So that conference really paled away. I should also add in 2009, for example, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, who is, infamous former Iranian president, his successor today, though, or in the last few days, that was elected, is really no different to Ahmadinejad. But Ahmadinejad was present at the conference in 2009, and so this also, I think, goes some way to show you the kind of rhetoric that you can expect there. Dozens of countries, including from Europe, actually walked out in 2009 as Ahmadinejad started speaking and spewing his venom and vile anti-Semitism, which is something that's become, inextricable from the very core of Durban. So this gives you a little bit of insight into what we've seen in the past in Durban, but ultimately the Durban event that's coming up in September, the 20th anniversary, that's being once again arranged under the purview of the United Nations, both in New York and also in Geneva as well, through the UN Human Rights Council, which is based there. And I would also add, although it's under the umbrella of the United Nations, each and every country that ultimately participates is endorsing it, is by their participation, they are saying that they are okay, that they endorse what the Declaration of Durban 2001 said, that they are okay with anti-Semitism, that they are okay with blatant racism against the Jewish state and Jewish people. So I think that's also important to bear in mind. Those that do participate ultimately endorse the very hate that's directed against us.
Absolutely. Arsen, another question here, where can one find which countries have declined an invite? As far as I'm aware, those who have, the countries which you mentioned, Australia, Canada, the United States, and now the United Kingdom, are they currently the only 4 countries who have confirmed that they will not attend the Durban IV conference? And if so, have any others declined before?
What do you mean declined? You mean withdrew?
Declined the invite for Durban IV.
Not that I'm aware of. At this point, only 4 countries have formally said that they will withdraw their participation. It may well be, by the way, that some countries that withdraw participation for whatever reasons may ultimately reverse that decision later. That's possible, by the way. That's not out of the realm of possibility. At this stage, only these 4 countries have formally announced that they will withdraw. These are also countries, including, by the way, UK, that are staunch allies of Israel and that have supported Israel strongly at the United Nations. But I think, as we've said, I would expect other friendly countries, both in Europe and perhaps elsewhere, including South America, to withdraw in the coming maybe days and weeks ahead. The UK was the first country in Europe to withdraw, so possibly others will follow now that follow your lead. But I should think there will be at least a number of other countries that will follow.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and what is Israel's position on Durban IV? You know, it walked out of Durban I, and subsequently, as you know, has boycotted the Durban conferences. What's its position on Durban IV?
Look, I have to be honest, I'm not sure if there's a formal position from Israel on Durban IV. As you may have gathered, we've also just had a new government that's been elected and sworn in. But I shouldn't think there'll be any controversy with it, just as every other previous Durban conference. I think you'll find there is consensus and unity across the political parties in Europe, and the understanding of the dangers of the Durban Conference presented, the way it framed the debate, framed the narrative, and denied the Jewish state our very rights, the way it vilified Israel on the international stage, the dangers that it presents that should persist in the manner it is at the moment, the way it will continue to be used as a source to carry out ongoing attacks to delegitimize Israel and ultimately to pursue some of the violent acts against Jews that we've seen across the world. So I would very much, even though it hasn't perhaps been announced yet, at least not that I'm aware of, but I certainly wouldn't expect that that Israel of all countries would participate in this really shame of a hate fest.
Okay, thank you. And as we know, the original conference was, you know, a conference against racism. What's aside from, you know, doubling down on the Durban Declaration, what's the focus of the Durban IV meeting?
Look, supposedly the focus of this particular conference will be on Africa, will be on issues of slavery and reparations. But you know, that is you know, that's what it's supposed to be about. But we also know that that this conference will also endorse the original Durban Declaration, and we also know that those detractors of Israel, those in the BDS movement, those that seek to demonize the Jewish state, those that are out on the streets calling for violence and inciting violence, that they will also use this as an opportunity to crystallize and to use it as a motivating tool to come together again and reaffirm the very campaign of hate and demonization that was first started in Durban. So notwithstanding the agenda might be very neutral, to talk about fighting discrimination, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, focusing on the situation in Africa. We know that as each and every other past conference, the reality is something very different. The reality is that this is nothing but a cover or pretext to launch a further assault and denial of rights to Israel.
Okay, well, Arsen, thank you very much. We'll now turn to give the floor to Natasha. Natasha's as I said earlier, Natasha is the legal director for the UK LFI, UK Lawyers for Israel Charitable Trust. So welcome, Natasha. And I give you the virtual floor.
Well, thank you very much, Steve, Richard, Dalia, the Zionist Federation, for the invitation. to participate in this important discussion. Of course, to all of our audience for joining, and to my friend and colleague Arsen from the International Legal Forum. We've been privileged to work together in the past to address important issues around Israel and anti-Semitism. And I have to say thank you for making the trip to London. It is indeed encouraging and a sign perhaps that we are getting back to pre-pandemic collaboration. Steve, this is a sort of celebration in that finally today we saw the official announcement that the United Kingdom is withdrawing from the September 2021 commemoration of the Durban Conference. So the UK will be on the right side of history with respect to this anti-Jewish hate fest. There hasn't been a U-turn on our foreign policy, as Arsen explained, given that the former Prime Minister David Cameron was clear about boycotting the previous iteration of this conference in 2011. And as we've heard, we've joined our friends and allies, the US, Australia, and Canada, in refusing to support this bigotry on display at the UN. But of course, the conference will continue without UK involvement, but with substantial support from the United Nations. And that is something, and I agree with everything that Arsen said, it's something that we must remain mindful of because of the significant impact that this has on inciting further hatred against Jews around the world at a time when we are seeing a substantial increase in anti-Jewish hate. And of course, over the last month, in particular, in the light of the latest conflict with Hamas in the Gaza Strip, we saw this manifesting itself increasingly also in violence against Jewish communities around the world. Now, the key to Durban, the Durban Conference, is the Durban Declaration and Programme of Action. This dates back to the Durban Conference in 2001, where after the US and Israel left, it was the European Union really that negotiated with the other states, including Arab Islamic states and South Africa, to produce that final declaration that Arsen described. And the Durban Declaration, by intent and in practice, is the 21st century reincarnation of the Zionism is racism slander that our audience will no doubt be familiar with. So after the Zionism is racism resolution, which was first adopted by the United Nations in 1975, was revoked by the General Assembly in 1991, it was the Durban Declaration that it took its place. And according to the Durban Declaration, Palestinians are victims of Israeli racism. Israel is the only state specifically mentioned in the entire global manifesto, notwithstanding that manifesto purports to address racism and xenophobia around the world. Now, in that context, I think it's important to say a few words on anti-Semitism. In terms of its focus, anti-Semitism has often looked at Jews as a collective. So while individual Jews might be tolerable, anti-Semites have had a primary problem with Jews as a separate collective identity. And it's been argued that this is why the majority of anti-Semitism in any given era tends to focus on the primary form of collective Jewish identity at that point in time. So throughout the Middle Ages, the primary collective form of Jewish identity was a religious one. It was a religious community, and Jews were hated for their religion. In the 19th and 20th centuries, when many Jews became secularized, the primary unifying collective identity of Jews was their ethnicity. And so that hatred mutated to focus on race. Well, today, many argue that the primary collective embodiment of the Jewish people on the world stage is the people of Israel and their nation state. And so Jews around the world are hated and held accountable for their state, even if they are not Israeli. And what we see is that in each instance, the essence of anti-Semitism is the same, but the focus may indeed shift. And Erwin Kotler, in Global Antisemitism, Assault on Human Rights, argued that anti-Semitism or anti-Jewishness is anchored in the denial of the very legitimacy of the Jews as a people. It is an assault upon whatever the core of Jewish self-definition at any given moment in time is, be it the Jewish religion or Israel as the civil religion, as he describes it, the juridical expression of the Jewish people. And this is where we see anti-Semitism at the UN manifested. Now, let's not forget that while anti-Semitism's focus can shift over time, in every generation, those manifesting such bigotry use some form of the variant, I don't hate Jews, I just can't stand X. So in order to justify their hatred in a socially acceptable way, anti-Semites need a rationale that can pass in polite society, ideally one that appeals directly to the highest source of authority that is currently on vogue. Anti-racism has for some time been that vehicle. And this is where I think the analysis of the late, great Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks exemplified this mutating virus of anti-Semitism. He tracked it through the Middle Ages, through to the Enlightenment or post-Enlightenment period in Europe, where science and the pseudo-science of eugenics was used to justify race hate taking over from the blood libel of the Middle Ages, and tracked it to today, where the source of authority, or the higher source of authority even than science, arguably, is international law and human rights. And so the language of international law and human rights is abused against the Jewish state. It is the modern form of the blood libel. Now, throughout this process, we have a theme emerging from the history of anti-Semitism, and that is the consistent attempt at the dehumanization of the Jewish people, or as Professor Eugene Kontorovich explained to the US Congress, the most effective anti-Semites have always sought to justify their bigotry by what Jews do. In every age, the oldest hatred clothes itself in the justification that appeals to contemporary values and public policy considerations. Now, it doesn't matter if the considerations are contradictory, even. Right? In the span of one generation, the main theory of anti-Semitism went from Jews being an inferior race worthy of destruction by the Nazis and the Holocaust, to Jews being a powerful race that tries to destroy others, like the Nazis and the Holocaust inversion. And in the light of that, I think it's worth saying a few words on the definition of anti-Semitism. Over the last 15 years, the IHRA non-legally binding working definition of anti-Semitism has become the internationally accepted standard definition of anti-Semitism. Now, there is no one exclusive or exhaustive definition of anti-Semitism. We've seen that it can and does take many forms, but the IHRA definition provides an objective baseline standard for what is and is not acceptable. It was adopted on the 26th of May 2016, and it's just worth registering that the approach of the IHRA definition follows a format that is increasingly used in administrative and regulatory documents. It is, for example, the approach used by the Bar Standards Board Code of Conduct, so my regulator, in that it gives a general definition followed by a number of illustrative examples. And I would also add that the use of such a widely accepted and adopted definition is also crucial to the generation of reliable data on anti-Semitism and analysis of trends. Now, the definition includes the carve-out that criticism of Israel, even in robust terms, cannot be regarded as anti-Semitic per se, and such criticism is therefore not captured by the definition. However, criticism of Israel in terms which are channels of expression for hatred towards the Jewish people, such as by particular invocations of the Holocaust or Nazism, will in all likelihood be anti-Semitic. And the definition includes these useful examples of discrimination or discriminatory anti-Israel acts or speech that can cross the line into anti-Semitism. Now, there's been recent substantial pushback on adopting the IHRA definition in light of an alternative definition that has been put forward. a definition that seeks to carve out anti-Semitism that masquerades as anti-Zionism, and it seeks to carve that out of the definition. This has been advanced as the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism. It's an initiative that has come from academia, where unfortunately anti-Semitism has found a modern legitimacy in intellectual discourse, and it's in this respect, its direction against Israel. I think that's especially as per Rabbi Lord Sax's explanation, through the use of the language of international law and human rights. So the key purpose behind the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism, the JDA, is to create a safe space for anti-Zionism. The purpose behind the JDA is clearly to set out its own examples of so-called anti-Zionism that the signatories seek to promote as acceptable. But the examples given of acceptable non-anti-Semitic speech are inextricably linked with anti-Semitic tropes. For example, the acceptability of double standards against the Jewish state, the promotion of BDS as not anti-Semitic, right? The BDS campaign has been quite clear that it regards the current state of Israel as incompatible with what it sees as the realization of Palestinian rights. Now, the JDA seeks to create a safe space also for the libels of settler colonialism and apartheid. And I think we need to be absolutely clear about one of the examples, example 12, where the JDA seeks to create a safe space for what it calls a variety of constitutional arrangements for Jews and Palestinians in the area between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, setting out different options for the elimination of the state of Israel and the ethnic cleansing of all Jews. Now, it disguises this, to be sure, in the language of full equality, but we cannot escape the political reality of what is advanced by these calls. Now, sometimes anti-Semitism might not be as obvious to a casual observer. That is exactly why there needs to be a definition to assess context and motivation. And it's also why anti-Semites do not like the IHRA definition, because it takes away their freedom to push past the line. And when criticism of Israel is done in a discriminatory manner, when double standards are applied, when Israel is singled out for disparate, disparaging treatment, that is not because of anything that Israel has done, but simply for what it is, the Jewish state. Now, an example of this type of treatment is unfortunately on regular display at the United Nations. As Hillel Neuer has said, it is legitimate for the UN to criticize Israel, which should be held accountable just like every other country. However, it is not legitimate when UN bodies do so unfairly, selectively, massively, sometimes exclusively, and always obsessively. And that is what we see in the Durban Declaration. And of course, we also have seen it for years at the UN Human Rights Council, which was established in 2006 to address human rights issues around the globe. In its first year, 100% of its condemnatory resolutions, all 9, targeted Israel. Israel remains the only country in the entire world that has a permanent agenda item dedicated to it. And from 2006 to 2016, 68 of all the 135 UNHRC resolutions, so that's over 50%, were targeted at Israel. The same insidious tendencies exist at the General Assembly. I am tremendously grateful that the campaign in this country, emanating from the Jewish community, with a lot of support from allies across the political spectrum, has been successful in finally having the UK formally withdraw. I should note, perhaps not before it had actively participated in all of the preparatory meetings for the Durban commemoration. But now that that is done, we need to do everything in our power to encourage other right-thinking democratic entities to follow that lead and do likewise, and stamp out, so far as we possibly can, anti-Semitism and Jew hate at the United Nations. And I'm delighted to take any questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Natasha. One question that I have, and and it's really a question that's directed to both you and Arsen, is where do we go from here? Currently, we have 4 countries now who have formally withdrawn or declared that they'll boycott the Durban IV conference. I know that Durban III, for example, I'm not sure exactly how many countries there were that boycotted it, but countries like Germany were amongst them, Italy, the Netherlands, France, New Zealand, Poland, the Czech Republic. Do you think that other countries will now feel emboldened to withdraw, or more confident to withdraw?
So it strikes me that there needs to be an awful lot more public pressure. Now, I appreciate that some of the issue here may be that the conference is not until September, and so it is not particularly high on the agenda of many governments, many parliaments, although I do know that a number in Europe in particular are now looking far more closely at it. One of the aspects of the campaign in this country that I was very impressed to see occurred over Twitter and social media, with ordinary Jews and communal organisations coming together to call out the UK's participation in Durban. Now, of course, the wonderful thing about social media, and Arsen has more experience, I think, than anyone else I know on Twitter, is that it is international, and that those within the UK can have a substantive voice around Europe and even further afield than that, especially because English is such a universal language. So that is something that I think fundamentally needs to continue. I know that the World Jewish Congress have also been actively articulating opposition to the Durban Conference, and they are a phenomenally powerful vehicle and voice on behalf of the global Jewish community. But you're absolutely right that the pressure, if anything, has to step up now. And that is not just so that countries feel better able, more equipped, more educated on this conference, and therefore better able to withdraw sooner rather than later, but also so that as much of the public as possible is aware of the true nature of the conference. Arsen mentioned some of the preparatory materials that have been put together, and there is a form of agenda that has been publicised, but conveniently perhaps it harkens back to previous resolutions that were passed and doesn't spell them out in word for word form. So it becomes, I think, additionally confusing. It looks pretty administrative, and the real essence of Jew hate and of the virulent anti-Semitism that prevailed at previous conferences is presented in quite a sanitary fashion, not just to the country representatives that have been involved in these participatory meetings, but also, of course, to members of the public as we get closer to September. So an information campaign on this is crucial. And that links in fundamentally with this notion that the information campaign, I think, also needs to be focused on the fact that anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism are one and the same. I do not believe that anyone can be in any doubt after the last few weeks, months of activity that we have seen against Jews on the streets, that anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism are not one and the same. Of course, this is a problem that has been prominent on university campuses, and the UN is another forum in which this bigotry is being allowed to run amok. Unless people are properly equipped with the facts on this, then we can't hope for better public awareness on the true nature of this conference. But that, I think, is the key to showing the conference for what it is, and seeking to limit its potential negative impact as much as possible.
Okay, thank you. So really leading on from that, what you've just said, someone here has asked a great question. Is withdrawal from the conference, rather than retaining a seat and challenging the declaration and the tone of the conference, is withdrawal the most effective means of supporting Israel, do we think?
Yes, absolutely. And I think we need to move away from this myth. We heard it from the Foreign Commonwealth Development Office here over and over again. First of all, it was well, we'll wait and see. what the content of the conference will be. Now, that was ludicrous on the basis that the content of the conference, in particular the adoption of the political declaration, was never going to change. That was evident from the outset. Everyone knew it. And it struck many people as somewhat disingenuous that there was a sort of wait and see attitude or position advanced when it was clear what the driving force, what the crux of this conference is about. But similarly, the idea that participation will do anything other than legitimize Jew hate is fundamentally misguided, because the agenda is set. It is the purpose of the conference. It is not a mere sidebar to it, or a sideline to it, or a footnote. It is fundamentally what this conference is about. And we have seen not just the content, but also the ramifications of this in terms of the obscene anti-Semitic imagery that supported previous manifestations of this conference, and also the platforming of Ahmadinejad that Arsen spoke about, and the sort of the free-flowing Jew hate through those previous manifestations. So the idea that any participation within this conference by right-thinking countries, those that actually uphold international law and human rights and democratic liberal values, is fundamentally misguided. They won't be able to have any impact on it, and all they can do is lend legitimacy to this. I very much appreciated Arsen's description of it, I think, as a Jew hate fest. That is the only thing that this conference can be described as.
Sure. Okay. It's come through as more of a statement, but I'd like to put this to you, Natasha. Both you and Arsen have spoken about the Durban Declaration and how this, this latest Durban IV conference will. The purpose of it is to reassert commitment to the Durban Declaration from 2001. There's an assertion here that the Durban Declaration from 2001 on the UN website isn't itself demonizing Israel. It was the speeches and rhetoric of speakers that was so ugly, but the final declaration seems much less than that. Can you comment on that? Can you give some further information on that?
It's an argument that I have seen made. It is one that I would respectfully disagree with. I'm trying to find now, forgive me, amongst my documents, the language of the meeting. But if we look at what is being proposed for September 22nd, 2021, which is what I have in front of me just now, there can be little doubt that it's producing the political declaration. It's a calling for the full and effective implementation of the Durban Declaration. And the words being used are, the General Assembly resolution also decides that the meeting will adopt a short and concise political declaration aimed at mobilizing political will at the national, regional and international levels for the full and effective implementation of the Durban Declaration and program of action. So that is what I was referring to at the sort of, the sanitized, somewhat perhaps misleading references to what this particular conference is about. Similarly, though, you did have the original wording of the 2001 resolution, which leaves no one under any illusions as to what the focus is. I mentioned that Israel was being blamed, Israeli racism was being blamed for violating Palestinian rights, but also crucially, of course, Israel is the only state that is being called out in this fashion. So in the same way that we see really obscene statements in the UN Human Rights Council against Israel, everything from issues being raised, obviously, of course, on a regular basis, misrepresentations with respect to Israeli conduct towards Palestinians, but also suggestions that Israel doesn't uphold women's rights or gay rights, which are entirely unfounded. Those sorts of mantras come through thick and fast. I'm finding the original, sorry, it's taken me a moment, but in terms of its references to the Middle East and the conflict with Israel, the Durban Declaration text says victims of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. So it's using general concepts, but at paragraph 63, we have here, we are concerned about the plight of the Palestinian people under foreign occupation. Now, the claim is made that those exact words don't equal the Zionism is racism blunt text of the 1975 resolution. But I would suggest that that completely misunderstands the language, the intent, the origins, and also the deletions in the original Durban Declaration, which is using an anti-racism platform to say two crucial things. Palestinians are victims of racism at the hands of the occupier Israel, and the other crucial thing to raise, as I indicated, was that no other state is singled out as victimizing anybody for racism. So that's the crucial issue behind it. It's not just everything that is said around the conference, it's the content of the resolution itself, which is so insidious and so damaging and so insightful to Jew hate. Oh, you're on mute.
Oh,
Steve.
sorry, very common Zoom mistake. Thank you, Natasha, for providing your perspective on that. Joy, I can see you've raised your hand, but please could you just submit your question in the chat, and I'll be very happy to put it to either Arsen or Natasha. Thank you. Some other questions here. Arsen, if you don't mind me asking you this question, what do you feel could be done to change the UN narrative on Israel? Do you think the UN could do with reform? Well, you know, a lot of us do think that. What do you feel could be done to effect that reform, if indeed you do think there needs to be reform? And yeah, overall, what can be done what steps can be taken to change the UN narrative on Israel?
Does the UN need reform? That would be understatement of the year. My concern and fear is whether the UN is capable of reform. We see, you know, the attack on Israel. You know, Israel. No one in their right mind would argue that Israel is above condemnation, or is not, or should not be following human rights or international law. Not at all. The problem is that Israel has been systematically denied equality and legitimacy before the international legal structure, and first and foremost, that is at the United Nations. Now, unfortunately, at the United Nations, it works in such a manner by pure mathematics. And generally speaking, we do not have the numbers. When you have the Organization of the Islamic States, which is something like 50 countries, then you have countries in Africa and some in Latin America, you easily have already over 100 in the General Assembly. Then you look at the other tools and agencies of the United Nations, like the Human Rights Council. This is a body that Natasha has spoken about and referenced that has, you know, condemned Israel almost more times than the entire world put together. This is the same Human Rights Council which elected Venezuela, a great beacon of human rights, Pakistan, a liberal democracy, China, who have incarcerated how many Uyghurs into concentration camps, Russia. You know, these are the countries that sit in judgment, not only of Israel, but of Western countries and democracies. And as Natasha again said, Israel is the only country which is subject to a permanent agenda item at the UN. Can the UN be reformed is a very difficult question. I'm not sure whether the UN itself can be reformed. It is possible. And I think ultimately, perhaps at the UN, as in other multilateral organizations, money talks. We have seen some progress made in some of the UN agencies, like UNESCO, for example, where after the US withdrawal, they subsequently changed tact. But it is very, very difficult to have any kind of meaningful reform at the UN. But what should we do? At the end of the day, Israel, like every country, albeit we might be outnumbered, we have a voice. And it wasn't that long ago, barely 70 years ago plus, that we didn't have a voice. Remember, the UN was born out of the ashes of the Holocaust. And at the end of the day, there is no alternative to the United Nations. Israel is a member state, and like every member state, we are entitled to have a voice and a say. And all those that truly support Israel and moreover stand for human rights and justice and the truth and what is really happening in the Middle East ought to be standing up and speaking that truth. I think that is the only way we can ultimately change the narrative or to change perspective. But it's an incremental war or battle where ultimately the sheer mathematics and numbers are against Israel. It's a place, it's a forum that is run in so many aspects by terrorists, dictators, and despots. And that's what we're dealing with.
And that indeed is the harsh reality. Like you say, it's a game of numbers. Has the United Nations accepted the IRA definition of anti-Semitism? And if not, is there a movement to get it to accept it?
It hasn't yet accepted it. I know that the current UN ambassador, Israel's ambassador to the UN, Gilad Erdan, was pushing this item in March of this year, seeking to get them to address it. But I just to comment briefly, perhaps on the sort of the hand wringing on what do we do. I appreciate, we are inevitably going to be drowned out in terms of numbers. And I may be naive, but I do think it is worth pursuing quality over quantity. And to achieve that, we need to be more robust in our pushback. The labels that are circulating within the UN and that form the core of the agenda at Durban are just that. They are falsehoods. And collectively as a global Jewish community, but also as non-Jews that value truth, human rights, international law, justice, democracy, there needs to be a much bigger voice pushing back against the falsehoods and with confidence. And actually, international law often features very significantly in debates around Israel. And it is where one sees the most virulent misrepresentations of what international law says. It is inverted and it is stretched and it is in many respects entirely fabricated. Now, it's very difficult, I appreciate, to, as someone not involved in foreign affairs or international relations and diplomacy or international law, to feel equipped to push back on these issues. But I think it's everyone's responsibility to educate themselves as much as they possibly can to do just that, and to try and set the record straight and do so in a confident fashion and unapologetically. So I think one of the pitfalls that we have suffered from previously is not wanting to appear too robust or perhaps even aggressive in putting the truth and putting our case. And one sees it, unfortunately, across community organizations' responses to what was going on last month in Gaza, but also to the positions taken on the Durban Declaration. The fact that many of us were sometimes making the government's excuses for them, saying, okay, we appreciate this is a difficult decision. No, there was nothing difficult about this decision. This conference has nothing to do with anti-racism. There was no push and pull in terms of being inside this conference. But so long as we seem to be hell-bent on making the contrary argument against our position, while at the same time advancing this is what we think the right thing to do is, we're going to find ourselves not only drowned out by the masses that are advancing a libelous case against us, but also I think doing ourselves a disservice on actually getting the truth out there. Sorry if that's a little bit, it's a home truth, but I think increasingly people with social media, with access to a voice, which is not just on mainstream media, and perhaps the democratization of the discussion. Now that of course includes an awful lot of people who say horrendous things, and they are given fuel by access to public fora and social media. But it does also create a playing field in which I think everyone can play a really crucial part in pushing back against the lies.
Indeed.
Stephen, if I can just just two words. I mean, first of all, 100% agree with every word that Natasha said, and would reinforce, the reference to pushing back against these falsehoods, and doing so in an unwavering and indefatigable and determined, uncompromising manner, I think is absolutely critical. We have to stand up and correct these malicious falsehoods and lies and attacks on Israel. But I'd also perhaps use, as an example, what you guys at the ZF did with respect to the UK. Ultimately, these decisions that countries make to pull out of events such as these, they're not made in a vacuum. Also, they're not made out of thin air. They're made because there is a significant push and advocacy effort in these countries, not just from the Jewish community, from friends and allies of Israel, on elected officials and lawmakers to convince them of the merits of withdrawing from conferences such as these that only promote hate and violence and intolerance. So I think, in a lot of ways, also what you guys did in terms of your letter writing campaign, in terms of outreach and advocacy to elected officials and lawmakers and our diplomats, is something that's crucial. The war on social media is also, one of the most important battlegrounds we're fighting, and not everyone perhaps is able to go to Parliament. Certainly not today, when we're living in a COVID era. We would have been great to have done this event certainly in person or in Parliament. But we are also fighting a war of narratives online as well, which is a crucial battlefield, and each and every person here is someone that can also be part of that campaign in terms of what we consume, what we post, and how we communicate what is happening in Israel and in conferences such as these, in order to get the truth out.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, what you've just said is exactly a point, that letter writing campaigns do work. There was a letter writing campaign that was circulated by many of the community organizations, including the Zionist Federation, lobbying the government to confirm that they would not attend the Durban Conference. And here we are. We've had an announcement this morning. So, these things do work. Messaging on Facebook works, messaging on Twitter works, on Instagram, on all social media platforms, phoning into radios. There's a place for, there's a place for everything. I have another question here. Is there a fine line between the need for publicity to get more countries to withdraw and giving the conference the oxygen of publicity? If it does go ahead, and it seems inevitable that it will go ahead, should we starve it of coverage and not promote what is being said and done? I'll put that to either one of you, Natasha or Arsen.
I think it might be optimistic to think that if we don't publicise the conference, that will kind of go unnoticed, because the key players here, not just countries, but also many of the anti-Israel NGOs that I should say have been set up, civil society organisations, very well funded, specifically for the purpose of promoting an agenda against Israel. They will ensure that this is a conference that at least makes headlines within the bubble that it is operating in, but also so much as feasible in the wider press and media and social media. But more than that, it sets another precedent at the United Nations. And for a long time, I mean, the saying in Israel, right, is shum, sort of UN, who cares about it? And I can see the sense in that attitude, because it does often feel that it is so removed from reality and there is nothing that we can possibly do to influence it. But unfortunately, that has an increasing impact, not just on the way that the general public view Israel and the situation, but also, unfortunately, in the way that international organizations, in particular international legal organizations, are approaching the conflict. And one of the best examples we've seen on this, and it's something that Arsen and I have been working a great deal on, is with respect to the International Criminal Court. If those of you in the audience will recall, earlier this year there was a decision by Pre-Trial Chamber 1 with respect to the question of jurisdiction, which was based very, very bizarrely, and sort of, throwing the legal position out of the window somewhat, based substantially on political resolutions, political declarations at the United Nations. And you can start to see how this circle starts to fuel itself. And of course it is, and has been for decades, the aim of Mahmoud Abbas in internationalizing the conflict, in adopting lawfare against the state of Israel. He was very open about this agenda in an article in the New York Times, in an op-ed, where he set out this plan and he has executed it. And Durban feeds into that project to defeat Israel in the international arena, where Israel's enemies have failed through traditional military means. So that's why I think as much publicity on the negative aspects of this as possible, because and the other reason I stress that is because one of the issues that the pre-trial chamber raised in deciding to go along with elements of the position that the Palestinians were advocating is that there was no pushback at the time from member states of the Rome Statute. There was no pushback, supposedly, when the Palestinians purported to join the court as a state party. So if there was ever a doubt that pushback is crucial, and we can't let these heinous resolutions and positions pass unchallenged, we're seeing further evidence of that on an almost daily basis.
Stephen, sorry, I'd say, I don't disagree with Natasha, and I'm not about to start now. That's for sure.
You're most welcome.
Rest assured, if I do find something, I will. But I think we agree on most things, which is also a good thing to know. Look, I know the only thing I would add on that is that we know for a fact that our detractors are getting ready. We know that. We see that in the discussions. We see that in the preparatory meetings. We see that in the media. And the question, by the way, is a very valid one, where you draw the line. But at the end of the day, we know that they are planning. We know that they are preparing. And I think for far too long, we as in the pro-Israel community have been too reactive, that we have waited for the fire to start before we put it out. So I think in circumstances such as this, where we know in advance what is happening, who is leading it, and why it is so destructive, we need to get out on the front foot. We need to get out there, and now we need to start delegitimizing those who seek to delegitimize us, and we need to paint the full picture of what Durban really represents and what all those who ultimately support it, what they are supporting. Because if we wait, once this explodes, we will already be playing catch up, and it'll be too late. We need to lead the narrative on this.
Okay, thank you. Now here's a question that's a very interesting question. The UK have pulled out of Durban IV, and we had a similar question earlier. Do you think this is the best way to help fight racism around the world? It's important, surely, for us to point out to the Black, Asian, minority ethnic community, non-Jews, how the UK government policy of withdrawal helps them. How does it help them? Either of you?
Not sure that well, if I understand the question correctly, it helps them because it doesn't allow anti-racism to be used as a fig leaf for anti-Semitism and cheapened in that sense, right? Yeah. We need to keep proper anti-racist campaigns consistent across all forms of anti-racism, and anything that where an issue is abused, and the same goes for international law, right? It's cheapened by its abuse to be used against the Jewish state. It undervalues international law. It devalues international law. It lessens the effectiveness, say, of the International Criminal Court when it's being used as a political instrument. And similarly, it cheapens what it is to be anti-racist and what it is to be an anti-racist campaigner. There are real forms of racism in the world. The fixation against Israel and the UN Human Rights Council is a perfect example of this. The real victims, in addition to Israel that is being targeted, are the real victims of real human rights abuses around the world that are being ignored because of the anti-Israel agenda that is being pursued. And likewise, for a conference that is ostensibly anti-racist and that focuses instead on Israel, as opposed to actually focusing on problems with racism around the world, that is the opposite of seeking to eradicate racism and seeking to help real victims.
Okay, very good, thank you. Arsen, the United Nations, can it, we've already spoken about whether the United Nations can be reformed. Here's another question on that. Can the United Nations be reformed by continued normalization between Israel and Arab countries after the Abraham Accords? Do you think that's one avenue of reform?
That's a fantastic question. It's one that will take time. The Abraham Accords will be only a year old come August, and we're seeing a lot of obviously incredible monumental advancements on a bilateral level and a regional level, but it's something that will take, I think, some time to take effect in the UN. We're seeing, I think, little pockets of hope. We saw that, for example, during the most recent war we had with the Hamas in Gaza, even during the UN context, where some of the countries from that we've made agreements with the Abrahamic Accords, who certainly modified their tone. Perhaps not necessarily the voting record just yet at the UN, that might take time, but they certainly modified their tone. And this takes time to build. I will give one example, perhaps of the Human Rights Council, where Bahrain recently was absent from a vote. There was a vote on an anti-Israel resolution regarding, if I'm not mistaken, regarding the situation in the Golan Heights in Syria. And this is a resolution that would normally reflexively, come up and vote in favor of without blinking twice. But miraculously, the ambassador was not even in the room at the time. This doesn't happen by coincidence. They were there the vote before, and they were there the vote after that. But it was just this particular vote they were not available at. So I think it's a fantastic question, but it's one that'll take time to eventuate and time to see tangible progress. Will it be enough to reform the UN as a whole? I don't believe so. That might depend on which other countries in the Arab and the Muslim world side with the Abraham Accords, and perhaps this is something that may be part of future agreements with those countries. The UN voting patterns. So that's something I think we'll need to see, but hopefully there are some positive aspects of hope that we're seeing in that regard.
Okay, thank you. So drawing this to a close, if I can ask you, Natasha, for your thoughts on how do we move forward with Durban, with the conference? What steps can activists take and communal organizations, the community as a whole? What steps can we take to continue to highlight the flaws of Durban and to even bring pressure on other countries to withdraw in line with the four that have done?
Well, as nice as it would be to rest on our laurels with the statement today, I think we do have a responsibility to advocate that that position be taken around the world. So anywhere where we as individuals have a contact to or some personal connection to other countries, utilizing those links. I know that the international effort is one that I've seen not just with respect to Durban, but the groups, community groups, and also individuals and advocacy groups that are working together on these sorts of issues are a force to be reckoned with. Advancing that, continuing the letter writing campaign, and using the representatives of other countries in the UK. So reaching out to them, it's something that I'm a Jewish diplomat with the World Jewish Congress, and it's something that we're encouraged to do by the WJC. And I do find, from my experience in meetings with diplomats in the countries in which they're serving, they are often better placed to act as an information gathering source, if you will, than the actual representative to the United Nations might be, or the actual representative in Geneva to the UN Human Rights Council may be, and they are able to feed back. So there are so many avenues, in addition to the letter writing campaign, the social media campaign that we can be pursuing, and through Jewish communities. The links that the UK Jewish community has to communities around the world are also incredibly impressive. We need to be doing as much as we can to support our partners abroad and to encourage the decision today to continue that ball rolling. We've had the US withdraw, Canada withdraw, Australia, and now the UK. I think that sets an incredibly positive precedent, and it's something that we can actively build upon.
Hear, hear, definitely. And might I also add that, you know, we can work closely with our Christian friends in the Christian communities who are very, very supportive of Israel, and communities, like you say, across the world, across the UK, across the world.
And I should say, I see a number of them in the audience today, which is wonderful. So you're absolutely right to point that out. Right. And I'm tremendously grateful to everything that the Zionist Federation has done.
Thank you.
For this particular campaign, and I'm sure we'll continue to do between now and September.
And thank you very much. Thank you, Arsen. Thank you for taking the time out of your very short trip to join us. Thank you, Natasha. It's been an absolute pleasure and a very insightful one too, to listen to you both, to listen to your expert knowledge, your advice. Please God, we'll host you again in the not too distant future. And we'll certainly look to take on the advice that you've given this evening. So on behalf of us, the Zionist Federation, thank you to both of you. Thank you to everyone for joining us this evening. I'll follow this up with an email tomorrow. I'll include some links to some relevant bits for you. But in the meantime, we'll let our guest speakers go and have a semblance of an evening. Thank you very much, everyone. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.